Galactic law gave her 72 hours to marry. The alien widow offered herself to a human. The great halls of the Galactic Tribunal on Virelle were built to inspire awe and fear, and as Selari stood alone beneath the hovering judgment sphere, she could feel every stare from the crowd of advisors, clerks, and watching elites pressing against her trembling spine. A blue light pulsed overhead as the ruling finalized, sealing her fate. You have 72 hours to remarry as per Article 14X of the Widow Reclamation Act. Failure to comply will result in reassignment to the state for reproductive integration. The language was sterile, mechanical, but the meaning was monstrous. Everyone in the chamber knew what reassignment truly meant. It meant that Selari, who had loved once, who had been bound heart and soul to Captain Virelle before he fell in the Battle of Lunar Gate, would be reduced to a womb, a genetic asset used for the future of a dying population. Virelle's blood had barely dried on Earth's red sands, his sacrifice helping to repel the Creole incursions from human cities. And yet this was the reward his widow received: a countdown strapped to her wrist, and a mandate to become someone else's property, or be biologically harvested. No grief, no mourning, no time. Just numbers. 72, blinking in a cold blue glow on her skin. The gavel slammed down, and the officials turned away like she no longer existed. No condolences, no honor. She staggered from the court with nothing but the thin gray robes of the widow's edict and the hollow weight of a forced future pressing on her shoulders. Outside, the sky wept acid rain, as if Virelle itself mourned what it had become. She had 72 hours to find someone, anyone, who would claim her as his wife, and she knew the odds were stacked against her. Virellan males were too politically cautious to bond with a dishonored widow, and the trade hubs were full of smugglers and brokers offering alternatives that made her stomach churn. That left one last hope: Earth. It was the only system where interspecies marriages weren't just allowed, but, in some regions, even celebrated. The humans were volatile and emotional, yes, but they were also unpredictable, and sometimes that unpredictability led to mercy. Selari's shuttle request was denied twice by the Virellan registry, no doubt by those who hoped she'd quietly disappear into state custody. But she sold her ceremonial ring, the last relic of her marriage, and bribed her way onto a human cargo vessel bound for Earth's western continent. She slept in the storage hold beside crates of Earth-grown citrus and fusion batteries, the countdown light from her wrist her only nightlight, ticking down through the hum of engines and the creak of old metal. 68 hours. 65. By the time she landed in the rainy city of Halvern, her eyes were rimmed red from exhaustion and her robes clung to her body with cold sweat. The humans stared as she walked the crowded terminals, some with curiosity, others with suspicion, and more than a few with hunger in their eyes. She asked questions with careful humility, learned the names of nearby registrars, and studied the local customs for legal marriage. Earth law was lax. Any bonded ceremony recorded and signed in front of a registrar drone could suffice. The problem wasn't the law. The problem was finding someone to say yes. She offered food credits, access to Virellan healing techniques, even her own labor, but no one trusted her. Alien. Desperate. Possibly diseased. Some whispered. Others laughed. One man asked her how grateful she'd be. Another followed her for 2 blocks before she lost him in a street tram. At 58 hours remaining, she nearly collapsed in a human park, shivering, sick, and hopeless. She considered returning to Virelle and surrendering herself just to stop the ache of rejection and fear. But then, through the mist and artificial light, she heard music, a soft, low melody carried by real strings, an instrument called a violin, she remembered, and the sound pulled her like gravity to the corner of a local university building, where a human stood outside in the rain, eyes closed, playing as if the world hadn't already ended. He was tall, rough around the edges, but his face bore the unmistakable marks of someone who had also lost everything. His music told a story of mourning, and in it Selari heard her own soul. She stood motionless, soaked and pale, until the music stopped. He opened his eyes, surprised to see her, but did not recoil. She asked his name. He answered, Elias Ward. She introduced herself, and when he asked why she was there, she didn't lie. Because I have 60 hours to live as a person, she said quietly, lifting her wrist to show the timer, 56, 49, 12, and counting. Elias blinked. What happens after that? He asked. The state will use me to breed soldiers, she answered. No voice, no name, just a vessel. He looked at her for a long time, the rain dripping from his brows. He didn't ask for her body. He didn't offer platitudes, he simply said, Come inside. She followed him up 2 flights of stairs to a modest apartment filled with books and strange machines. Photos of a smiling woman, now faded, were placed on a mantel, above a cold hearth. Selari understood immediately. She was your mate? She asked. My wife, he said. Died 2 years ago in the Creel conflict. Field medic. She saved a squad of your people before she bled out. Selari bowed her head. Then I owe her my breath. Elias gave her a towel, a blanket, and a place on the couch. They did not speak much more that night, but before he fell asleep in the adjacent room, she whispered, Elias, will you marry me? He didn't answer. In the morning, with 49 hours left, he handed her tea and asked for the full story. She told him everything, about Torvin, about the tribunal, about the reassignment centers where women never returned, about the hidden trafficking masked as law. And you came here, Elias murmured, because humans might be foolish enough to help. Because you've known grief, Selari said, and sometimes grief makes hearts soft. He was silent for a long time, staring at the wedding photo on his wall. If I say yes, he said slowly, you'll be safe? On paper, yes, she replied. They won't risk challenging a human-bonded spouse under Earth's own sovereignty. And what would I get? He asked, not with greed, but with honest curiosity. Selari didn't hesitate. Loyalty, silence, care. I'll clean. I'll cook. I'll warm your bed if you ask. No emotion. No demands. Just protection for both of us. Elias stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the dripping city. The weight of memory crushed his chest. You shouldn't offer yourself like that, he said. It's not fair to you. Nothing about this is fair, Selari replied, but it's survival. He turned back toward her. Then I have one rule, no love. I can't give it. I won't fake it. Agreed, she said. No love. He stared at her wrist as the timer ticked down to 47:55:01. Then he nodded once. We'll go to the registrar tomorrow. Relief flooded her so hard that she wept, not loud, not dramatically, just quiet, uncontrollable tears that soaked the human-made blanket around her shoulders. She didn't want his love, not yet, not ever maybe. But for the first time since the tribunal, she wasn't alone. The countdown still ticked, but now it moved forward alongside a new hope. Somewhere in the distance, the storm eased, and in its wake, something strange and dangerous stirred between them. Something both had sworn not to seek, but that neither could fully avoid. The morning came muted by thick gray clouds, and Selari rose before Elias, sitting silently by the window with her blanket wrapped tight around her frame, watching the humans below walk with umbrellas and steaming cups, so unaware of how fragile everything could be. Her countdown now read 47 or 39, and every blink felt like another piece of her slipping away. But this time she didn't feel completely hollow, just slightly tethered, however fragile, to the quiet, grieving man asleep in the other room. When Elias finally emerged, shirt rumpled, hair mussed, and face lined with exhaustion, she stood and bowed slightly, her instinctive gesture of respect. Good morning, she said, unsure if humans even used greetings the way Virelans did. But Elias only nodded, rubbed his face, and handed her a mug of coffee. Bitter, hot, and unfamiliar, but she accepted it with both hands. You don't have to bow, he said, sitting across from her at the small table. "I'm not your master." "You're the reason I'm still free," she replied gently. "That is enough to earn respect." He didn't argue, just stared at her, still trying to reconcile the image of a woman so elegant, so composed, with the knowledge that she had begged for a marriage not out of affection or even attraction, but necessity. Over a few awkward sips of coffee, they outlined their plan. Elias would take her to the local registrar before noon, where a drone recorder could witness and certify the bond. The certificate would then be filed in Earth's civil registry and transmitted intergalactically to Virelle, marking her legally bonded under human law, which overrode Virellan mandates for immigrants under a protective clause formed after the War. But as simple as it sounded on paper, the emotional complexity pressed down like an invisible weight. Elias wasn't the man he used to be. The war had shattered him. After losing his wife, Lena, he had buried himself in work, avoided people, and kept his life small. Now this stranger, this alien widow with silver-lined eyes and a voice that carried the cadence of ancient poetry, was crashing into his silence with desperation and dignity all at once. Selari, for her part, had never imagined herself kneeling to a human, let alone offering herself. But war took pride as well as lives. And what was pride if it meant captivity? As they prepared to leave, she shed the damp widow's robe and emerged in a simple earth-tone dress Elias had found among Lena's old things. Selari was taller and slimmer, and it clung to her in ways it hadn't to its original owner. But Elias said nothing. He only handed her a coat and opened the door. Outside, the rain had paused, and the air smelled like wet concrete and diesel. The registrar's office was just 4 blocks away, tucked beside a clinic and a municipal drone hub. As they walked, Selari noticed the way people looked at them. A human man and an alien woman walking side by side, not touching but undeniably linked by something unspoken. Curiosity, discomfort, even disapproval. But Elias ignored it all. His hands jammed into his coat pockets, his gaze locked forward. Inside the registrar building, they were greeted by a polite but robotic assistant who offered them a clipboard and asked flatly, "Marital declaration? Temporary or permanent?" Selari froze. Temporary marriages existed under Earth law for political or protective reasons, sometimes lasting as little as a year. It would be safer, cleaner. Elias looked at her, waited. "Permanent," she said softly. The assistant raised a brow but didn't comment, handing them a legal consent form and gesturing toward the recording chamber. The drone scanned their IDs, confirmed their blood signatures, and recorded the exchange. No vows were required, no ceremony, just their mutual agreement and a biometric confirmation. Selari pressed her thumb to the scanner, then Elias did the same, and with a soft chime the system spoke. "Union confirmed. Spousal record transmitted." And just like that, Selari was married. Again. But this time not for love or destiny, but to survive. She didn't cry. Not even when the countdown on her wrist blinked twice, then shut off entirely, its blue light fading as the system synced with Earth law and deactivated. She looked at Elias. He didn't smile. He didn't speak, but he placed a hand gently on her back and guided her out of the room, like a man who understood what loss tasted like, even in victory. They returned to his apartment in silence. Selari changed into the dry clothes Elias provided and folded the widow's robe neatly. Placing it beside a small shrine she improvised from old books and a candle stub. Then she sat beside Elias at the table and asked the question neither of them wanted to answer. What now? Elias stared at his coffee, then out the window. We live, he said finally. Just try to live. It wasn't a promise of joy or even stability, just existence. But Selari accepted it with grace. Over the next day, something quiet began to form between them. Not romance, not yet, but something gentler than survival. She learned to cook with human ingredients, burning the first few attempts but determined to master the art. He repaired a broken music player and taught her how to use it, watching with quiet amusement as she became obsessed with Earth's classical compositions, especially piano sonatas. In the evenings, they would sit in the small living room, he with a book or a datapad, she with her thoughts, sometimes daring to ask him questions about his late wife. He answered without bitterness, only sadness. Lena had been kind, brave, laughing even when bleeding. Selari shared stories of Torvin, his dry wit, the way he sang off-key in the shower, his fierce protectiveness of their squad. It was in these exchanges, these shared memories of love lost, that a fragile bridge formed between them. Still, they kept their pact, no love, no expectation, just cohabitation, legal safety, and emotional neutrality. But neutrality had a way of cracking. One night, as thunder rolled across the horizon, Selari stood at the window, her silhouette illuminated by lightning. Elias watched her from the doorway, something tight twisting in his chest. "Why did you offer yourself to me?" he asked suddenly. She didn't turn. "Because you weren't cruel." "That's a low bar." "In my world," she said, "kindness is rare currency. You didn't touch me. You didn't mock me. That was enough." "But you said you'd warm my bed," he murmured, stepping closer. Her shoulders stiffened. "I meant it, if you ask." "I won't." "Why not?" she asked, finally turning, her eyes luminous with more than just light. "Because I don't want you to offer yourself like a debt." "What if it's not a debt?" she whispered. "What if it's choice?" Elias was silent. He didn't move. Neither did she. The space between them pulsed like a wound trying to close. Then slowly she stepped forward, only inches from him now. "I'll be yours," she said softly. "No conditions. Not for law. Not for protection. Just yours." Elias reached out, fingertips brushing her cheek. But before anything more could pass between them, a shrill beeping erupted from his datapad, a priority message. He turned, checking the screen, and his face went pale. Selari stepped closer. "What is it?" He turned the pad toward her. A headline blinked. "Widow Countdown Program under investigation for human rights violations. Corruption allegations involving Virelle state." Below it, names scrolled. Widows taken. Sold. Disappeared. Her name was there, listed as missing, not registered safely. Her marriage hadn't yet been uploaded to the galactic system. And worse, she was being hunted. Her heart seized. The timer on her wrist hadn't been a legal device. It had been a branding tool, a tracking signal. And now someone would come looking, not to enforce law, but to reclaim what they believed they owned. Elias looked up, his eyes hardening with a fire she hadn't seen before. "They're coming for you," he said. She nodded slowly. "Then we fight." And in that moment, all their walls cracked, not with love, but with resolve. A war hadn't ended, it had only changed shape, and they would face it together. The moment Selari saw her name flashing across the interstellar newsfeed marked "Missing, High Priority Reclamation," the air seemed to thicken, and the safety she'd so briefly tasted disintegrated like ash in the rain. Elias didn't speak for a moment as he absorbed the weight of what it meant. The countdown wasn't merely a bureaucratic mandate, it was a branding beacon, and the marriage registration they'd filed hadn't been uploaded in time to trigger official protections. Somewhere in the network, she was still listed as an unclaimed widow, property of the Virelle state. And now that the Galactic Tribunal had launched a quiet investigation into corruption, those running the Widow Reclamation Centers were scrambling to hide their tracks. That meant eliminating loose ends, and Selari, having fled, was their most dangerous one. Her heart pounded like a drum against her ribs as she stepped back from the screen, instinctively glancing toward the apartment's thin windows. "How long before they find me?" she whispered, her voice sharp with fear but also lined with a growing steel. Elias stood slowly, crossing to the reinforced door and checking the old-fashioned bolt out of habit more than security. "If you We're tagged by a passive beacon. They've probably already triangulated your landing zone. A day. Maybe less. She clenched her fists. Then I've put you in danger too. Elias shook his head. No, Selari. They already crossed the line the moment they marked you like cattle. This isn't just about you anymore. His voice was low, steady, but the fury burning just beneath it was unmistakable. He moved quickly, pulling a duffel from under his bed and tossing in emergency rations, data chips, and 2 old but fully charged sidearms. Selari watched him move, marveling at how his entire demeanor had changed. No longer the quiet man haunted by his past, but a soldier again. Someone who remembered how to fight when the line between peace and tyranny snapped. She followed him to the storage cabinet and retrieved her own emergency field cloak and the plasma knife Torvin had once given her, still hidden in the hem of her old widow's robe. They didn't need to speak. There was no time, and too much had already been said. By the time dusk painted the sky in bruised oranges and dull grays, they were in his transport pod, a civilian-grade hopper retrofitted for speed and stealth. The engines hummed as Elias guided the craft away from the city and toward the edge of Earth's authorized atmospheric corridor. Selari remained quiet, eyes scanning the skies for any sign of pursuit, but the dread in her gut twisted tighter with every kilometer they gained. "Where are we going?" she asked finally. Elias didn't take his eyes off the nav screen. "Off-world, I've got contacts on Virelle Station, former medics and engineers, people Lena and I worked with during the Creel conflict. They don't ask questions and they hate the tribunal." She nodded, relief flickering behind her eyes, but it was brief. As they cleared the final atmospheric gate and ascended into the black, the long-range scanner flashed with a silent warning. 2 ships inbound, unregistered, sleek and armed. Selari leaned forward, frowning. "That's not police." Elias confirmed it grimly. "No insignia, no call signs. They're not here to talk." The first blast struck just behind them, rocking the pod with a concussive jolt that sent sparks flying from the console. "Shields at 70, Elias barked, rerouting power to the rear deflectors. Selari strapped herself in, heart hammering. "They'll board us if they catch up." "They won't," he growled, flipping a hidden switch. Beneath the pod, retrofitted afterburners lit up in a flash of searing blue, and the ship surged forward like a bullet, slicing through the edge of the inner asteroid ring surrounding the Sol Gateway. The pursuing ships followed, weaving between debris with inhuman precision. "Drones," Selari spat. "Automated retrieval craft." Elias cursed under his breath. "Then we can't outrun them. We have to outsmart them." He dove toward the ring's dense quadrant where magnetic interference scrambled tracking sensors and twisted the pod into a violent spin through rock and ice. Alarms screamed, warning lights flashed, and Selari closed her eyes, trusting Elias more than she trusted the technology now threatening to kill them both. A chunk of debris smashed into the starboard wing, but Elias pulled them through, jerking the pod around a final outcropping before cutting engines and drifting dark in the shadow of a massive ancient mining rig long since abandoned. The drones zipped past, missing them by meters, their scanners unable to penetrate the thick mineral layers. For 2 full minutes, the only sound was Selari's breathing and the soft ping of cooling metal. When the danger passed, Elias powered the engines at minimal thrust and broke orbit, setting course for Virelle Station, which hovered in the trade-neutral zone just beyond Earth's formal jurisdiction. They arrived 5 hours later, blood pressure still high and nerves frayed, docking under a false registry code and stepping into the shadowy metal corridors of a forgotten alliance. Virelle Station was a patchwork of old warships welded together into something barely stable, run by exiles, smugglers, and medics with more honor than the tribunal. It smelled of oil, rust, and survival, and Selari felt oddly at home. Elias led her through the maze of corridors to a small room where an older woman, human, scarred, and sharp-eyed, waited with arms crossed. "You bring a Virellan widow. Here?" she asked, not unkindly, just wary. "She's not property," Elias answered. "She's my wife." The woman's eyes flicked to Selari, And you trust him? With my life, Selari replied. The woman grunted, nodded once, and opened the door behind her. Then come in. We've got things to discuss. Inside, a small group of resistance operatives huddled around a holographic display showing various shipping lanes, tribunal patrol, patterns, and encrypted broadcasts from whistleblowers across the system. Selari and Elias explained everything: the countdown, the failed registration, the drones. When Selari showed them the now-dead tracker embedded under the skin of her wrist, one of the operatives hissed, "That's a prototype branding tag. Not standard issue. That means someone high up wanted to keep personal tabs on you." "Why?" Selari asked. "I'm no one." "Not to them," the woman replied. "You're proof. Proof the tribunal's Widow program isn't about survival. It's about trafficking, political control, genetic manipulation. And if you're still breathing, you're a threat to the lie." A silence fell over the room, thick with implications. "Then let me be more than a threat," Selari said, voice steady. "Let me be the match that lights their house on fire." The woman smiled for the first time. "You've got spine, I like that." Over the next day, they stayed hidden in the bowels of Virelle Station while the resistance gathered data, leaked false transmissions to confuse Virelle sensors, and quietly uploaded a full record of Selari's story. Her original marriage to Torvin, her escape, the countdown, the fake legal tools to thousands of private networks. The story exploded. Within hours, it had reached not just Earth's media hubs, but dozens of independent galactic channels. Hashtags formed, protests ignited. Other widows stepped forward. The tribunal was forced to respond, but their statement was cold, evasive, and full of legal jargon, and public fury only intensified. But the more noise they made, the more dangerous it became. On the second night at Virelle, Elias and Selari sat in their quarters, a quiet corner that smelled faintly of ozone and old leather. She sat on the bed, fingers interlaced, watching him as he removed his coat. "We can't stay here forever," she said. He nodded. "I know. And I've already dragged you into too much." "You didn't drag me," he said firmly. "I stepped in." A pause. Then she stood, moved to him, hands gentle on his chest. "I meant what I said back on Earth. I'm yours. Not for safety. Not for survival. Just yours." He looked into her eyes, the weight of his grief still lingering, but something softer pushing through. "I don't know if I can love again," he admitted. "Then don't love me," she whispered. "Just stay. Let me stay." He kissed her then, not with heat or hunger, but with the quiet desperation of two broken souls finding warmth in each other's presence. That night they didn't make promises. They didn't need to. In a galaxy full of betrayal, what they had was fragile, but real. And when the next message came, warning them that a high-value bounty had been placed on Selari's head, they didn't panic. They packed. They planned. And they prepared to take the fight to those who had tried to erase her story. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was war. The silence before the storm was always the heaviest. Selari stood in the dim chamber of the Virelle Station outpost, staring at the flickering screen that displayed her face plastered across bounty networks. Target, Class Alpha, retrieval or termination authorized. The reward offered was obscene, enough to bankrupt a border colony or fund a private army. She should have been afraid, paralyzed by the knowledge that death squads and bounty hunters now prowled the stars for her, not just out of obligation, but temptation. And yet she felt no fear, only fury. Beneath her skin burned the aching, raw power of someone who had been hunted, branded, and stripped of everything, and yet had found a reason to keep breathing. Elias stepped in quietly behind her, his silhouette, long in the low light, and she turned to him, drawing strength from the way his eyes never wavered, never looked through her like she was a burden. "We can still disappear," he said softly. "Forge IDs, run to a mining colony, live in shadows." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that broke hearts. "And leave others to be dragged back in chains?" Elias looked away, jaw clenched, then exhaled. "Then we make our stand." The resistance operatives on Virelle had been preparing something bold, an infiltration of the Widow Registry Corps on Keltron, a tribunal-controlled world that housed the digital archive of every widow's identity, status, and location. If they could get Selari inside, she could trigger a purge of her own record, along with others who had been marked unlawfully. It wouldn't bring down the tribunal, but it would burn a hole in their web. The mission was suicidal. Security on Keltron was elite, layers of biometric locks, drone hounds, and neural scan checkpoints. But Selari had something they didn't. Her own skin, her retinal imprint, her brand code, even her voice signature could grant her limited access if used correctly. Elias volunteered to go with her, despite knowing full well that his presence would compromise stealth. He didn't care. He wasn't going to watch another woman die while he stayed behind. They left Virelle in a ghost ship rigged with pulse cloaking, tech flying through the dead belt where navigation was erratic and comms were useless. In the dark, cramped cockpit, Elias reached across the console and took her hand. No words. Just warmth. Just presence. They arrived on Keltron under cover of a supply drone wave and breached orbit at the far edge of the night sector. Landing was rough. The station AI detected their anomaly, but they jammed the signal and ejected the pod at low altitude, crashing into the sand dunes outside the perimeter wall. Bruised but breathing, they moved through the shadows. Selari, in a stolen widow's robe, hood drawn low, while Elias wore the uniform of a tribunal tech officer who had met an unfortunate end in a bar fight 2 sectors back. The entry checkpoint loomed like a beast carved from stone and fire, its gates lined with sensors and guards with steel eyes. Selari approached alone, presenting her wrist and voice in a quiet chant. Widow Class 7, Registry Sync Initiation. The system hesitated, glitching slightly due to her forged overlay, but then blinked green. Access granted. A drone scanned her spine and eyes. She trembled, not from fear but fury. It was like walking back into her own funeral. Inside, the registry core pulsed with the thrum of data. Rows upon rows of terminals, servers, and suspended operators, half cybernetically connected to the stream. She moved like a ghost, navigating with the muscle memory burned into her from years of training. Elias joined her in the lower archive chamber, slipping through maintenance corridors until they reached the quantum core. This was it. The seed, the one place where every widow's fate was reduced to lines of code. Selari stepped up to the console, placed her hand against the interface and whispered, "Override, Widow Directive, Authorization, Selari Virelle Torvin." The system resisted, a cold AI voice echoing through the chamber. Request denied. Status, terminated. Widow not valid. "No," she snarled. "I'm still breathing." She pulled the plasma blade from her hip and sliced her wrist. Not deep, but enough to spill blood onto the interface, activating the archaic biosync failsafe reserved for identity disputes. The system lit up. Blood match confirmed, access granted. With trembling fingers, she began the purge, one name at a time. First her own, then the others she remembered, widows she had known during the brief, awful weeks in detainment. Their names vanished from the registry, their trackers nullified, their contracts erased. Alarms erupted. The system had caught the anomaly. "You've got 60 seconds, Elias shouted, drawing his sidearm as guards burst into the outer hall. Selari kept typing, ignoring the rising scream of alerts. 30 more, she whispered, sweat beading on her forehead. Elias fired at the first guard who entered, dropping him with a precise shot to the shoulder. He wasn't trying to kill, just delay. More swarmed in. He was shot in the leg, staggered, but kept firing. "Selari!" he shouted. "Now!" She hit the final command. "Widow Purge confirm." "Yes." The system stuttered, then blinked out. Across the galaxy, thousands of widow trackers went dark. Thousands of women were suddenly, blessedly, no longer property. But Selari didn't move. She turned to Elias, eyes wide. "We did it. Then let's go." But as they fled the chamber, another squad met them at the corridor. Too many, too fast. Elias shoved her into cover and stood to draw their fire. "No," she cried. "Elias, don't you dare." "Go," he shouted. "If I die, let it be with you free." She surged forward anyway, slashing at a guard who tried to flank them, her blade finding bone. Elias, bleeding, grunted as he pulled her beside him, both of them backing toward a narrow shaft. "There's no exit," she hissed. "There's always a way," he said. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small, spherical device, the emergency transporter beacon Lena had once carried, rigged for short-range jumps. "It's unstable," she warned. "It'll collapse if we jump together." "Then we jump together," he said, wrapping his arms around her. "If we die, let it be like this." She pressed her forehead to his. "I'm not afraid." "Neither am I." He activated the beacon. Light enveloped them. Heat surged. The last thing she heard was the roar of collapsing walls, the screams of guards, and then nothing. Blackness. Silence. Then air. Wind. Stars. She gasped, sitting up on rough gravel. Elias lay beside her, groaning, alive but bruised. They had landed miles from the registry. Smoke bloomed in the distant sky. Sirens echoed. But they were free. They had done it. They had burned the lie. Days passed, then weeks. They became phantoms, slipping through smuggler networks, passing through planets under aliases. But the news traveled faster than warships. The Widow program had collapsed. Protests erupted on Earth. Tribunals fell. Some were tried. Others vanished. And through it all, Selari and Elias stayed hidden. Until one day, on a quiet moon with violet skies, he built her a home. Not a cell, not a cage. A place with windows wide and walls filled with music. She gardened. He wrote. They never married again. They didn't need to. They belonged to each other not by law or decree, but by choice. One night, under a moonlight that bathed the hills in silver, Selari turned to him and whispered, "I thought I had to be someone's to survive, but now I know I only had to be yours." He kissed her forehead, wrapped her in his arms, and they watched the stars burn peacefully for the first time in years, not in war, but in beauty. The hunted widow was no longer running. She had made her stand and won.